Now this is our second video introducing us to our Long 1 assignment, part 1, and this is bracketing. Now, one of the first things that I want to address here is what you're going to take pictures of, because at the end you'll, often students have this question. I don't actually care what you photograph in this particular assignment. I do think it's to your advantage to experiment and photograph in many different scenarios or scenes. So thinking in terms of lighting, think about photographing indoor, outdoor, dark, light. Think about photographing something that's still versus something that's moving, something that's near, something that's far. Now, if you feel like you just want some more specific guidance, I've given you some suggestions here. I said you can photograph whatever you'd like, but if you want some help with ideas, here's a few. Photograph light, what hides in the shadows, what makes your eyes squint, photograph the things in the world that you can't touch or see, stop where it's warm or where it's cold and make a photograph. How is the temperature changing the light, if at all? Revisit the same scene throughout the day. Those are all things that I'm, just suggesting, but absolutely are up for grabs, but not required. So, if you have any more questions on that front, don't hesitate to ask. Now, I'm going to walk through talking about this first, but then I'm in tandem going to have the screen or the menu screen of our Nikon D3500 or our camera available, so you can see the walkthrough of how I'm putting these settings into the camera. Now I want to go over some of the camera settings I want you to have for this assignment, and I want to make some specific suggestions because in order to do this bracketing assignment, we're going to be taking a lot of photographs, and because it's an exercise, I don't want to eat up a ton of your data or memory on your memory cards. And so I'm going to make some suggestions that are both technical in terms of photography and the longer term things we're going to be learning, but also specific to this assignment. Choose some settings that will cater to making your lives a little easier as well. So in the bottom right hand corner here, you'll see a kind of demo video happening of me going through the menu settings on that Nikon D3500, showing you how to go through what would be your info or particular camera shooting mode settings. So you can follow along with your camera, and if you have something similar, or make certain that you go through your manual for your particular camera if there's anything that seems significantly different. Now we're going to start with the lowest ISO possible on your camera. Generally that ISO is going to be 100, and if you want to just choose 100, that's fine. I want to make a specific note, and we'll go through this in a minute, but this might need to change depending on your light conditions, and I'll give an example of that. Your highest resolution for your image or file size, I want you to save space here. So we're not shooting RAW yet. We will later in the semester, but I want you to choose a JPEG. Now you can choose fine or whatever the kind of smaller JPEG sizes you want. I'm going to choose fine and a small file size of that. That's just going to make a smaller, more manageable, more portable file for us. In addition, I don't want you to have the flash on. I want you to be in manual mode, and in a second we'll go through and demo a step-by-step process and explain why I want you to be at that 60th of a second for your shutter speed. Primarily that's because at a 60th of a second you are holding your camera and handheld, you're not using a tripod. And if you go any slower than that with your shutter speed, so meaning that the shutter is going to be open longer, which is going to be 50th of a second, 40th of a second, 1/8 of a second, and a full second, and so on, you introduce shake into your image, and your image will look blurry, or not blurry, but shaken. The other direction, and this is based on some of the videos that you should have watched at this point, will be faster shutter speed. So 125th of a second, 250th of a second. Those are all much faster, and that helps you not only reduce shake by hand holding a camera, but will also freeze moving subjects. So the camera simulators are pretty great at demonstrating that, so keep that in mind. Now I'm going to go through the step-by-step process here. I'm going to start by reading this text and then explaining through the interface of a camera and going through an example visually, an example of bracketing based on these directions. So the step-by-step process, you will choose a scene to photograph and complete 10 images per that scene. You'll do this with 30 different scenes. Complete each scene you photograph in this order. So step 1, you're going to start by taking a correctly exposed picture based on what your camera's light metering reads. Okay, so when it's at that 0 in the middle, what it's telling you is a proper exposure. I want you to take that single photograph. So that's one image. Using only your shutter speed, so only changing your shutter speed, you're going to take 2 more images underexposing your film, a stop in each of these frames. So you'll take of that same scene that you're photographing, that same thing you're directed at, you're going to take a single image underexposed 1 stop, and that's usually a single larger notch depending on your camera's way that it visualizes its light meter. So that would be 1 stop underexposed, and then again a second image at 2 stops underexposed at this second larger notch. So that should have you with 3 images, right? So then you're going to take 2 more photographs here, overexposing a stop in each frame. So 1 stop overexposed, and a second here overexposed. So that should have you at this point with 5 total images, just using shutter speed to over and underexpose 4 of those images. Now, it's a little redundant, but it's going to help you visualize it when we start to process these images. I want you to, in step 3, retake that original photograph at the proper exposure. So this step 1 and step 3 should be identical images. Then in step 4, using only your aperture, you're going to take 2 images underexposing your film, a stop in each frame. So just aperture, 1, then a second one, 2 stops underexposed. Then you're going to take 2 more pictures overexposing your film, a stop in each frame. So 1, 2. And so that should have you with another 5 total images, with a total amount of 10 images per that single scene. Okay, so as I mentioned before, note, you may need to change your ISO in order to achieve the bracketing required. So we're going to go over a demo here and explain what that means. Now, I'm going to demo by showing the back of the D3500, the Nikon I'm using, and just the interface it has. Now, I'm just showing you how I'm dialing up and down the shutter speed. Going to mess around a little bit with showing you the aperture as well, showing you how those dials look, and how they're in fractions versus f-stops with the aperture and our ISOs at 100. So we have all our settings where we'd like them for this assignment. Now, I'm going to keep in line with the example here and start with 125th of a second, which is a faster shutter speed than 60th, just for hand holding. Okay, now I'm going to bring down that f-stop, or open it up more, so more light is coming in, so I can get closer to that 0 mark. Now notice in our light meter, it's not right exactly at 0. That's totally fine. That's a very fraction off. Don't worry about that right now. So I take that initial photograph. That's what the meter is telling me is proper exposure. Now I'm going to use my shutter speed, and I'm going to start to overexpose. And overexposing means I'm going to open up or slow down that shutter. Okay, so it's open longer is basically what that means by one stop, and then open that up longer again. Now notice I'm dipping below that 60th of a second. Now I think that's okay for the sake of this lesson, but just remember that a 60th of a second is that kind of ideal zone before you jump to a tripod. Now I'm going to bring it back, and I'm going to underexpose. So if I have a faster shutter speed, the shutters open less time. It's going to let in less light and be darker. So one stop and then a second stop. Notice that progression. So we have a gradation. So that's 5 images. Now I'll take that original one again, right? So at that 0 marker, and that should be redundant with the step 1. Okay. Now we're going to use aperture to underexpose one stop. So the larger the f-stop number, the smaller that opening is, the less light that's coming in. That's one stop. F9, then we're going up to F14 at 125th of a second shutter speed to get 2 stops underexposed. We'll go the other direction, and we've opened up here our aperture all the way, the max the lens is capable of. So now we're in a situation that I explained with ISO, where we're at 125th of a second at f5, which is the max opening it can go. So we need to make our sensor more sensitive. I'm going to jump to 400. Going from 100 to 200, 200 to 400 opens up or doubles the amount of light coming in, or the light sensitivity of that image. Now, that was an example of us going through photographing a single scene. A reminder that you should have 10 images per scene. So your step 1 and your step 3 are going to be identical, and it's what your camera is telling you is a properly exposed image. And only using shutter speed, you're going to underexpose 2 stops, and then you're going to overexpose 2 stops. That should give you 5 images up to that point. Then only using aperture, so coming back to that original setting, the original settings you had for proper exposure, you're only going to use aperture and overexpose and underexpose 2 stops in either direction. That should give you 10 total images. We went over an example of the need to use ISO. A reminder that going from 100 to 200 on your ISO is you're doubling the amount of sensitivity, so you're doubling the amount of light that it can take in, so that's a single stop. And same with going from 200 to 400, you're going another stop. All right. Now, use this example just as a guide. This isn't where you set your camera. You need to set your camera based on what scene you're photographing. These are just written examples. All right. And so every scene is going to have a different lighting situation, so it might not mimic this exactly. The photograph I took of the window wasn't exactly like this. I just tried to come as close as possible. Now, make no less than 300 total exposures for this assignment. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is a deadline only. You're not turning in these 300 images. We're going to use these images next week when we get into part 2. And that's where you're going to start doing some editing and processing. And then we'll post those and look at those. All right, good luck. Have fun shooting. I can't wait to see your work.